Hey everybody, this is History Student Reacts, and welcome back to another Historia Civilis reaction. I would really appreciate it, by the way, if you guys would like this video, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, which has some exclusive Historia Civilis reactions. Anyway, today we're reacting to Roman elections. Little interested to learn about Roman elections, since, we haven't talked about them yet. So I think this will be pretty fascinating, and let's just jump right into it.
At this point, it should be clear that the Senate was at the center of political life in the Roman Republic.
Yes.
And of course, we know that in order to be appointed to the Senate, a person first had to be elected to the office of quaestor by the people. But how were they actually elected? And once in the Senate, how were they elected to higher offices? That's actually a pretty complicated question. If we're talking about elections, we have to talk about public assemblies. You may have noticed that when this comes up, I tend to just drop the phrase public assembly and leave it at that.
Yep.
That's been a bit of shorthand on my part. There were actually 3 different public assemblies responsible for electing politicians. Each was summoned at different times and had its own rules. And most importantly for our purposes today, they each elected different politicians. So let's jump in.
Assembly
The
of the
most prestigious
Centuries.
public assembly was called the Assembly of the Centuries. Century is in the Roman military unit. This body elected the highest-ranking Roman officials, consuls, praetors, and censors. I haven't really talked about censors yet. They were highly respected ex-consuls who were in charge of keeping the official membership rolls for the Senate. In practice, every newly elected quaestor was inducted into the Senate automatically, but it wasn't official until a censor added him to the list. They were also in charge of conducting an official census, which assessed the net worth of each citizen and divided them up into different classes. These classes were important because they determined how people voted in the Assembly of the Centuries. There were, broadly speaking, 8 different classes, which were further subdivided by wealth and age into 193 voting blocks.
Wow.
Of the 8 classes, the highest ranking one was the patricians, who had 6 voting blocks specifically set aside for them.
Of course.
The patricians were basically the most prestigious families in Rome.
So it seems like what we're getting to is that this was a sort of estate system, which we would see throughout history and throughout European history since the Roman Empire, with, the aristocratic estates of France, for example. So this is not an uncommon way of dividing things, but I think we're about to see how the different estates or different groups factor into the voting process. And of course, the patricians, very famously, are the class at the top of the pyramid, the richest, most well-respected elites of Roman society.
Not necessarily the richest, but the ones with a history.
Not necessarily the richest, I take that back. But I do believe the most well-respected and those with sort of historical respect. They have long family lines.
Of public service, going all the way back to the monarchy.
Right.
Most of these men would have been either senators or the sons of senators. This was an incredibly small group, probably several hundred people, but divided up into 6 blocks, they had immense influence. Just below them were the equitae, who were assigned 12 blocks. Think of the equitae as the top 0.1% of Roman society. Very, very rich. Many were richer than the patricians, but just hadn't been lucky enough to be born into the right family. The equitae were considered an aristocratic class, with special privileges, separate from normal Roman citizens. But membership in this class was dependent on them maintaining their wealth. Together, the patricians and the equitae accounted for a little over 9% of the voting blocks. Now we finally get to normal Roman citizens. This group consisted of the wealthiest non-aristocrats in Rome, and is called the first class. Think the top 1%. Rich, but otherwise normal people. This class was allotted an overwhelming 80 blocks.
Wow.
From here, the wealth threshold decreased predictably.
Yeah,
the second class, the third class, and the fourth class were each allotted 20 blocks. The fifth class, at the bottom, was allotted 30 blocks. And finally, below the 5th class, we have one final group called the proletarii. These were people with no property and no savings, basically people living hand to mouth. These were the urban poor. This group, which was by far the largest, was allotted just one giant block.
Interesting. So proletarii, obviously the root of the word proletariat that Marx would later popularize. As you can see, obviously this is somewhat democratic, but extremely weighted to the top. If we look at, so if you break it into upper class and lower class, the lower classes from like middle down have, let's see, 20, 60, 20, 40, 60, 90, 95 votes total. And then the 3 upper class blocks have, let's see, 80, 92, 98. So the 3 upper class blocks have more votes in total than the 5, middling to lower class blocks. So that shows you that at any time, the richest upper class, most respected citizens, the elites of Rome could dominate the non-elites. So obviously we're talking, and we're going to get to the elections. I'm not sure actually how democratic they were. There is, if there is voting, which I presume there is going to be, it's democratic to a certain extent, but extremely weighted to the top.
One additional detail. Classes 1 to 5 were each internally subdivided based on wealth. Each wealth level was further subdivided into one senior and one junior block. The senior block was for citizens 46 years and older, while the junior block was for adults 45 and younger. And now, finally, we get to voting.
Here we go.
Each sitting consul had the power to call for a meeting of the Assembly of the Centuries, and would then set the agenda for that meeting. This agenda was almost always an election, but it's worth noting that this was also the body that officially ratified the Senate's request to declare war. But this wasn't War Day, this was Election Day. On Election Day, everybody interested in voting gathered on the Field of Mars, just outside Rome's city limits. As people arrived, they divided themselves into their blocks. Each block was marked apart from the others by wooden fences or pens that had been set up in advance. To begin voting, one of the junior blocks in the first class was chosen at random and given the honor of the first vote. Why one of the junior blocks? Just to make things more complicated. Each block voted internally, and when a winner was decided, the block cast their one vote before the entire assembly. It didn't matter how many people were in that block, or how strongly that block supported a particular candidate. Each block's vote was weighted the same. But things get a little bit more complicated.
I guess at a large scale, you have to organize things somehow. And this is certainly a way of doing that.
All elections of the same type were conducted simultaneously, meaning that if, for example, 2 consuls needed to be elected, each block had to give 2 names. They couldn't vote for the same candidate twice. They basically had to rank their top 2 candidates.
Interesting.
After the results from the first block were announced to the entire assembly, the other 39 junior blocks in the first class voted simultaneously. These results were tabulated and announced. After this, the patricians, the equitae, and the senior blocks in the first class all voted. For this reason, the patricians and the equitae are sometimes considered part of the first class, but I decided to separate them for the sake of clarity because, Jesus Christ, it's complicated enough. After these blocks were all done voting, there was another pause while these results were tabulated and announced. At this point, 98 of the 193 votes had been cast, which is like 51%.
Yeah.
If there was a consensus and all candidates received an absolute majority of the votes, the winners were announced and voting immediately stopped.
That's exactly right. Now, I'm sure the upper classes weren't necessarily always that united, but this is a system where if the elites, decide on a candidate, then they can just vote for them and that's it. Voting's done there. We've already decided, and the middle and lower classes of Rome won't even get a chance to vote at all because they've already gotten the majority.
But if not, voting continued, progressing down the classes, until one candidate received an absolute majority. When that happened, it was announced, and the victor was taken out of consideration. If all classes voted and there was still one or more candidates without a 50% majority, voting continued the next day, and then the next day, until there was a winner. That's kind of confusing, so let me try to simplify it. The question wasn't, how many votes does a candidate get? The question was, which candidate can get to 50% before the others?
Yeah.
The moment a person got to 50%, they were done. The game being played here seems clear. The elites voted first, so if they could all get behind the same candidates,
there we go.
They never even had to consult the poor. When the elites were split, that's when the poor got to have their say.
Right.
The proletariat had it really bad. The only time they mattered was in the case of a tie. But that was only one kind of public assembly. There were two others. The tribal assembly was significantly different from the assembly of the centuries. This body was responsible for filling some of the lower-ranked offices, like military tribunes, quaestors, and curule aediles. Just a reminder, military tribunes were the young aristocrats that were elected and assigned command positions in Roman legions. Quaestors were the people that, upon their election, were appointed to the Senate. Aediles were in charge of administrative things like public games, and the upkeep of temples, and keeping the streets clean. Now, the tribal assembly only elected half of these, called the curule aediles. There were two kinds, but their jobs were virtually the same. The only difference was that the curule aediles could be either patricians or plebeians, whereas the other kind, which we'll get to later, could only be plebeian. The tribal assembly did also have one high-profile job to fill. They elected the Pontifex Maximus, which was the head religious official in Rome, and was a lifetime appointment. Pontifex Maximus aside, these offices were all lower in status, and the method of voting reflected this. Just like before, the tribal assembly was usually summoned by and had its agenda set by consuls. Praetors could do this too, but in practice it was usually consuls. Voting happened like this. All Roman citizens were organized into 35 tribes. These tribes were not based on ethnic divisions, but rather on where the person lived. They were geographic. Kinda. 4 tribes were set aside for the city of Rome, and the other 31 were spread out over the rest of Roman territory. We don't know exactly how they were spread out, but we do know that most of them were concentrated in Italy.
Right.
That all seems pretty straightforward, but here's the curveball. Tribal membership was hereditary, meaning that if a family moved, they took their tribal affiliation with them. After generations of internal migration, you can understand how this became a complete mess.
Yeah, that would seem to get very complicated. Plus, and I presume he'll get to this, the question of, like, do they all have to come to Rome to do this? Because that would seem to be basically a massive clusterfuck. Like, gather everybody together to come vote. Plus, like he said, everyone's been moving around, and yet the position's hereditary. So, maybe you're, an elector from Rome, but now you live in Hispania. So that's got to be kind of complicated.
Censors did their best to clean things up by manually changing people's tribal affiliation, but it was an impossible task.
Yeah.
When the tribal assembly was called, the tribes separated into their 35 pens. Each tribe, or block, got one vote. And by one vote, I mean they each gave their list of their top candidates, just like before. One block was chosen at random to start things off, and voting continued randomly until a candidate or candidates received an absolute majority of 18. When that happened, voting immediately stopped. Unlike the assembly of the centuries, there was no overt bias in the tribal assembly towards the rich. It was still a race to 50%, but voting was randomized, so each tribe had an equal chance of getting their voice heard. But it certainly wasn't fair. Citizens living in Rome found it easy to set aside a day to vote in the tribal assembly.
I mean, you can already see where he's going for this. There's no official bias against the poor, but if you're living in, like, Illyricum or Hispania, basically very far away from Rome, the only way you're going to make it to Rome is if you're rich and you can afford to not work and spend the money to travel. So obviously this unofficially would exclude sort of lower class and perhaps middle class people, without officially doing it like the Assembly of the Centuries did.
So the 4 blocks representing the city tended to be very large and very poor.
Right.
But the further you got from Rome, the fewer people were able to make the trip. This made these blocks smaller but of equal electoral weight. Those who did make the trip from the Italian countryside and beyond tended to be older, richer, and more powerful on average. As a whole, this meant that the tribal assembly tended to favor the interests of rich Italian landowners at the expense of the urban poor. Sometimes the tribal assembly was called on to vote on something less important than an election. When this happened, 18 of the 35 tribes were selected at random and told to meet in the forum in the center of Rome. Here, this limited group voted in a similar manner. We get the impression that these meetings were very poorly attended, because a rule had to be made that a block had to have at least 5 people in it in order to vote. That's pretty bad.
I mean, yeah, that's pretty terrible, but also not surprising, because think of how inconvenient it must be for people who live far away to come drag themselves to Rome whenever a vote takes place. So it's not necessarily surprising that turnout was seemingly so low, although obviously it's not a great position to be in.
This assembly couldn't declare war like the Assembly of the Centuries could, but it did have a few other jobs. It was possible for an important trial to be decided before the tribal assembly, but this became less common over time. They also technically had the power to rubber stamp legislation passed by the Senate, but that was almost always done by another group. In the video about the year 57 BCE, the one where Cicero's banishment was overturned, I cut out a big chunk related to this because it derailed the story, but I might as well bring it up here. The first bill overturning Cicero's banishment had been passed by the Senate, but Clodius had successfully stopped its ratification when he and his armed supporters marched on the crowd. What I didn't mention was that Pompey made sure that the next time the bill came up for ratification, it went before the tribal assembly instead. As I said before, the tribal assembly tilted in favor of the rich Italian landowners, who happened to be big fans of Cicero. So when Pompey toured the Italian countryside whipping up support, what he was actually doing was meeting with Cicero's supporters and convincing them to make the trip to Rome to attend the tribal assembly.
Right.
The plan worked, because when the bill came up, every bloc that voted in the tribal assembly voted in favor of the bill. But this was an unusual event, and normally the Senate's legislation went before a third kind of public assembly, which we get to now.
Here we go.
The Plebeian Assembly, also known as the Council of the Plebs. You can probably guess from the name what it means. Only plebeians were allowed to vote in this body, no patricians allowed. The Plebeian Assembly was summoned by and presided over by a tribune of the plebs. On election day, this body elected plebeian aediles, which we talked about before, and tribunes of the plebs. Unlike the other 2 assemblies, this one didn't have complicated rules governing it. This was a straight up or down vote. This is the closest to democracy that Rome got.
Yeah.
The Plebeian Assembly was the only body where the urban poor could dominate. This is why we have a long line of tribunes of the plebs, even conservative ones, that got elected by promising either subsidized or free food. The Plebeian Assembly had another equally important job. This was the body that almost always gave its rubber stamp approval to Senate legislation. The only rule was that there were no amendments and no debate, just a simple yes or no vote. The moment a bill passed the Plebeian Assembly, it became law. By the late Republic, alongside an increase in political violence and gridlock in the Senate, we start to see this body elect a series of extreme tribunes of the plebs.
Yes.
It's hard to single out things like this, but I can't help but think that if the poor hadn't felt muzzled in the Assembly of the Centuries and the Tribal Assembly, they wouldn't have felt it necessary to stack the one office they had control over with dangerous men. But we'll never know for sure.
Always got to listen to the outro song, and yeah, from my understanding, often the tribunes of the plebs had some beef with the established political order, the Senate, etc., etc. Probably because it was the one place where, the poor of Rome could actually exercise their power and their opinions. So yeah, That was a really interesting one. I'm actually really glad we learned about that, because we're always talking about elected officials in Rome, but now we actually know how elections work. Basically, mostly skewed towards the wealthy upper classes, which isn't surprising. But with some definite elements of democracy, and the plebs. There was that, like Historia Civilis said, that's the closest you're gonna get to direct democracy in Rome. So yeah, very interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I certainly did. Stick around for more reactions. Please check out the Patreon, which has exclusive Historia Civilis reactions. And I will see y'all again next time. Goodbye, and have a good day.